Ask yourself a question right now honestly. You can probably picture the face of at least one famous serial killer without even trying. Now try to name one of his victims. For most people, that second question just goes silent. This isn't a failure of memory. It's a feature of it, and understanding why reveals something uncomfortable about the way your brain decides what deserves to be remembered. Start with the obvious asymmetry. A killer usually has one face, one name, one story that gets told over and over across documentaries, podcasts, and headlines. A victim, especially in cases involving multiple victims, often becomes part of a list, a number, a statistic attached to a larger, more compelling narrative that isn't really about them at all. Your brain didn't choose this on purpose. It's simply following rules that evolved for an entirely different purpose than solving crimes or honoring the dead. The psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years studying a pattern so consistent across human behavior that he and his colleagues gave it a name almost embarrassingly blunt in its honesty. Bad is stronger than good. Baumeister's research found that negative events, negative people, and negative information consistently produce stronger, longer-lasting psychological effects than positive or neutral ones of equal magnitude. This isn't a character flaw. It's a survival mechanism. For most of human history, missing a threat was far more costly than missing an opportunity. A person who failed to notice a dangerous animal might not survive the mistake. A person who failed to notice a particularly generous neighbor simply missed out on a nice conversation. Evolution built a brain that leans hard toward remembering danger, and a killer is danger given a face, a name, a pattern, a story with a villain at its center. A victim, by contrast, often represents the opposite of a threat. They represent loss. And loss, as unfair as this sounds, doesn't activate your brain's threat detection system the same way a predator does. It activates grief, which is a slower, quieter, and far more easily overwritten emotional response. This alone explains part of the imbalance. But there's a second mechanism that makes it dramatically worse once more than one victim is involved. The researcher Paul Slovic has spent decades studying something he calls psychic numbing, and one of his most cited findings sounds almost like a paradox until you sit with it. People tend to feel more emotional connection to a single identified victim than to a group of many, even when the group's suffering is objectively greater. Slovic's research shows that as the number of victims increases, each individual life within that number becomes, in the mind of the observer, statistically smaller and emotionally quieter. One name is a person. 10 names become a list. 100 become a statistic. Your brain isn't built to hold expanding grief in proportion to expanding numbers. It's built to attach emotion to individuals, and it strains, then quietly gives up, the moment the individuals start multiplying. This is precisely why true crime coverage, media specials, and even casual conversation naturally gravitate toward the killer instead of the victims whenever a case involves more than one person harmed. Not because anyone consciously decides the killer matters more, but because the killer remains one coherent character throughout the entire story, while the victims fracture into a growing list that your brain has enormous difficulty holding onto with equal emotional weight. Consider what this does to the shape of the story itself. A narrative needs a through line, a single figure whose choices, thoughts, and actions the audience can track from beginning to end. In almost every retelling of a multi-victim case, that through line becomes the offender, not because storytellers are careless, but because the offender is the only character who appears in every single scene. The victims, tragically, appear once each. This connects to something the criminologist Jack Levin has studied for decades, specifically why certain offenders achieve a strange, unwanted kind of fame that outlives the memory of anyone they harmed. Levin's research into what's sometimes called the celebrity criminal phenomenon found that repetition itself, regardless of the moral content of what's being repeated, builds familiarity, and familiarity is one of the strongest predictors of what a brain ends up remembering. A killer's name gets repeated across every retelling of the case. A victim's name typically gets repeated only within their own smaller story, one that receives dramatically less coverage, dramatically fewer documentaries, dramatically less cultural gravity. Levin's work suggests this isn't really about admiration. Most people don't consciously idolize offenders. It's closer to unconscious reinforcement. The more a name appears in any context, the more familiar it becomes, and familiarity gets misread by the brain as importance, even when the underlying content is horrifying. Put these three mechanisms together, and the imbalance stops looking like an accident and starts looking like an inevitable outcome of ordinary psychology. Baumeister's negativity bias means the threat gets remembered more vividly than the loss. Slovic's psychic numbing means that loss gets diluted the moment more than one person is involved. And Levin's familiarity research means the offender's name, repeated constantly across every retelling, becomes cognitively sticky in a way victims' names, mentioned once and rarely repeated, simply cannot compete with. None of this means people consciously care more about killers than victims. It means the architecture of memory, media, and storytelling all quietly conspire, without any single person intending it, to build monuments to the wrong people. This has real consequences beyond mere trivia. Victim advocates have long pointed out that this imbalance shapes public policy, media coverage, and even courtroom dynamics. When a case becomes primarily a story about the offender's psychology, motives, and eventual capture, the victims risk becoming footnotes in their own tragedy, remembered collectively rather than individually, if they're remembered with any specificity at all. Some newsrooms and true crime creators have started deliberately resisting this pull, choosing to open certain stories with a victim's name, their ordinary daily life, their unfinished plans, before ever introducing the person who ended them. This isn't just an ethical choice. It's a direct intervention against the exact psychological mechanisms driving the imbalance in the first place, forcing the brain to attach a face and a story to an individual before the offender's more narratively dominant presence takes over. Think back to the question at the beginning. The killer's face came easily. That wasn't a personal failing. It was Baumeister's negativity bias making the threat vivid, Slovic's psychic numbing quietly diluting every name beyond the first, and Levin's familiarity effect rewarding constant repetition regardless of what's actually being repeated. The victim's name, if you found it at all, took real effort. That effort is exactly the point. Every mechanism working against that memory is invisible, automatic, and deeply ingrained, which means remembering the name anyway isn't nothing. It's one of the only ways your mind can push back against exactly the pattern this video just spent several minutes describing.